Jenna Ellis. I don't have to introduce Jenna Ellis. At this point, she's part of the family, but I will anyway. She's a director of the Dobson Policy Center and a contributor to the Daily Wire and the Washington Examiner and the excellent Federalist. Her book is The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution, a guide for Christians to understand America's current constitutional crisis. How you doing, Jenna?
I'm great, Drew. Glad to see that you still have the Ted Cruz beard. I'm a fan.
Ted Cruz has the Andrew Klavan beard. I'm sorry.
That's true. Yes. And in the Twitter poll, I think it got a 79% approval rating. So that was a really great thing.
That's why I'm just governed by popular opinion.
Absolutely.
So one thing that Trump didn't do last night is he didn't declare an emergency. Sources say he's still out about that. I was kind of glad he didn't. What's your take? I've heard legal scholars say that he won't get away with it, declaring an emergency and just spending the money. What's your take about it?
Well, I agree with you that I think it's a good call right now that he hasn't declared a national emergency, but he absolutely could. And the difference right now in our court system between whether or not someone in Congress or the executive branch is actually able to use their constitutionally vested powers depends on an activist court. And we've seen that over and over and over again. And so the bottom line to this is not whether or not President Trump actually has that power, but whether or not an activist court, especially in the Ninth Circuit, is going to try to stop it.
But eventually that would get to the Supreme Court, would it not? I mean, and John Roberts has always been kind of pro-executive power, although he did slap at Trump when Trump talked about an Obama judge.
Yeah, and I think it will go to the Supreme Court. And what will be interesting is to see if the kind of vitriolic messaging between Justice Roberts and Trump and that relationship will kind of override Justice Roberts' just opinion and his faithfulness to originalism. I think that we saw that with the Obamacare decision in terms of siding more with liberals on that. And so it'll be interesting to see what Justice Roberts does. But if we're looking at just a faithful application of the Constitution, the rule of law, and all of the delegation that Congress has provided to the president, and that's the president, regardless of whether that's Obama or Trump. In 1983, the Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision actually held that where Congress delegates authority to the executive, they can't try to then block the policy that is enacted and the actions undertaken just because they don't like how a president acts in furtherance to that delegation of authority. And so what we're seeing is that the Democrats really, and their messaging last night was so evidential of this, that they just don't like Trump. But the policy and how he decides to use his powers is why we have elections. And he is the president, regardless of whether people, hashtag not my president.
So answer me this, too, because this is something I'm really confused about. Yesterday, I think it was, the new governor of California, Gavin Newsom, said, we are now going to be a sanctuary state. All are welcome. In New York, the mayor of New York City says they're going to give free health care to everybody, regardless of their status. If the federal law is that people who come in here illegally can be deported, why can a state say that this is a sanctuary? Why are they? I mean, if for instance, a state said, well, we're not going to have gay marriage in our state. We're not going to recognize it. We're not going to permit it. The law would come in and say, no, you have to. It is now federal law because of the Supreme Court decision that this is a right that gay people have. They couldn't disobey that. Why should California be allowed to disobey federal law?
Well, so this goes into a separation of powers question that isn't just a separation on the federal level between the three branches of government, but a separation horizontally as well between the federal, the state government, and, by the way, the individuals. We always forget that part, that there's also powers not given to the state or the federal government that are reserved to the individual. Okay. But the Obergefell decision actually was completely unconstitutional because defining marriage is actually given to the states, where sanctuary city policy goes directly against the Constitutional's vestment in Article 1, Section 8 of immigration rules and legislation to the federal government. So it becomes a difference of whether or not this is a state versus a federal question. And marriage issues, healthcare issues, education issues, so many things that the federal government has stepped into actually do belong to the states. So on the state funding of healthcare, states can choose to spend money their own money however they choose, unless there is a competent constitutional law to the contrary. If they start spending federal money, they would probably risk losing it. But sanctuary city policy goes directly against the federal government's vested power to determine immigration policy. So that's why that is unconstitutional. But probably spending state money on healthcare would not run afoul of the Constitution.
Is there any remedy that the federal government has when California says we're now a sanctuary state, or a city says we're now a sanctuary city? Is there anything the federal government? I mean, they're not going to come in, I assume, and arrest the governor. What, are they helpless?
Well, no, I mean that, and this is why the sanctuary cities and that whole issue needs to go before the Supreme Court, and we need to argue the separation of powers and say this is a federal government question. And also Congress needs to legislate. I mean, here we have President Trump, who is really the only one that is caring about comprehensive immigration reform, not just on a national emergency imminency question, but providing for the rule of law comprehensively to address these questions that we've all been talking about for over a decade. And so Congress is really the one that needs to act. They need to have a clear federal law that is against sanctuary city policy. And even if that's challenged in court, we do have a conservative majority that hopefully will faithfully apply the Constitution and say states, no, you can't. And then that way hold them in some kind of contempt, foreclose federal dollars for sanctuary cities. I mean, there are other remedies that are punitive and that can force the states to comply with federal law. That's the design of separation of powers. And that's why the Constitution provides certain powers to the federal government that are good for the general welfare, meaning the entire nation. Because if California allows a sanctuary city, that's going to affect me in Colorado. That's going to affect people in any other state.
Yeah. All right, Jenna, it's always great to see you. Thank you very much. That was really clarifying. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Drew. Great to see you.
I'll see you soon. All right.
Sounds good.